In this video, I will be using MySQL Workbench to build a many-to-many relationship between students and courses. To start off with, let's make the entity student. Please note that again I'm using camel casing for attributes with the first letter as lowercase. I'm leaving the default attribute types in place. The second entity is course. Now obviously if I were to actually want to capture all the details about a course and all the details about a student, these entities would be more well defined with more attributes and the attributes having specific data types. As this is an example, I have left the default data types in place and have not filled out the entities completely. To create a many-to-many relationship between these two entities, the many-to-many relationship implying that a student takes many courses and courses can have many students, we need to use a new type of relationship in MySQL Workbench. N:(M). This icon allows us to create a many-to-many relationship between two entities. When we click on that icon, and please note at the bottom it says select the first table to be joined. In this case, I'm going to select the student entity. It says student selected, please select the second table. In this case, I'm going to be selecting the course entity. As I have selected student and course, I have now an associative entity between student and course that captures the relationship between student and course. A student can take many courses, a student has course, and a course can occur many times in student has course. This student has course entity, one can think of it as enrollment. This captures the enrollment of a student in a course. This is how one can create a many-to-many relationship and the associative entity between those two entities that have the many-to-many relationship. A couple of things to note. Enrollment has a composite primary key. Student_student ID and course_CRN are part of a composite primary key in enrollment. If I would like to, I can change what these attributes are called. I can just refer to it as student ID and CRN. That makes it a composite primary key. Another thing to note is because student ID in enrollment is part of a composite primary key and that student ID is a primary key in student, the relationship is a solid line. The solid line in MySQL Workbench represents an identifying relationship. And since we have two solid lines over here, there are two identifying relationships between student and enrollment and course and enrollment. This is because student ID and CRN, which are primary keys in student and course respectively, form part of a composite primary key in enrollment. To create tables based on this data model, we have to first start by creating the tables on the one side of the relationship before creating the table on the many side of the relationships. To do that, the tables on the one side of the relationship can be created with the following statements. The create table statement we are familiar with. Over here, we have two create table statements, one for student and one for course. A few attributes in each of those entities or each of those tables, and setting the primary key for each of those tables. The trick is in creating the enrollment table. In creating the enrollment table, we're going to actually have two columns, one being student ID. The data type of the student ID column in the enrollment table needs to be exactly the same as the data type of student ID in the student table, which is of type integer. Similarly, course ID in the enrollment table also needs to be of the same data type as the primary key of course, which is course ID, which is integer as well. The primary key for this entity is going to be a combination of student ID and course ID. Please note, in this data model, the combination of these two attributes form the primary key. One can see this that if you take a look at, one can see the enrollment table have a combination of student ID and CRN as a composite primary key. In our case, we don't have CRN, but we have course ID, and so student ID and course ID, and we can rename that if you'd like, is going to be a composite primary key. That is how we establish a composite primary key. Obviously, we now need to create constraints. So a constraint is going to be creating constraints is very similar to creating constraints in typical one-to-many relationships. So the constraint has a name. There's a foreign key involved in the constraint. Let's start with student ID. And it references the students table's student ID. Similarly, we have another constraint. I'm just going to copy the previous constraint. In this case, we're going to say enrollment has, instead of student, we're going to refer to the course, where the foreign key is course ID, and it references the course table's course ID with on-delete restrict. This allows us to create an enrollment table with a composite primary key of student ID and course ID, and each of those attributes are also serving as foreign keys in the enrollment table. So let's run each of these statements. The create table statement has been successfully executed. The create course has been successfully executed. And the create table enrollment is now successfully executed. This is how one would go about creating three tables that have a many-to-many relationship.